Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our lecture on absolutism and absolute monarchs. In part 1, we introduced what the idea of absolute monarchs were, talked about how they are kings and queens who pretty much controlled all the power within their state's boundaries. But then we started looking at the story that evolves into the Bourbon family in France. We had talked about Henry of Navarre, who started out as a French Huguenot or a French Protestant, who later became Catholic. He was killed, but in the process he was able to start the Bourbon dynasty, which brought us to Louis XIII, who was a very weak king and had a cardinal rule in his, basically in his stead. And then we have what we'll come to here is Louis XIV, and he really is kind of the cornerstone of this whole story, because as we're moving closer to the French Revolution, we ultimately want to see some of the causes that bring us there, and Louis XIV absolutely is a cause of the French Revolution. Though it may come a little bit later, his actions certainly set some trends that will cause problems later on. So let's go ahead and take a look here at Louis XIV. Louis was the kind of guy who loved to spend money on himself, really loved to live lavishly, and we're absolutely going to see that here as we talk about him. So let's go into Louis XIV's story. Again, you want to definitely be careful with your Roman numerals here. XIV stands for 14. So, Louis was 4 years old when he became king. Now, obviously, he's not going to rule at that age, but he has an experience when he's really young that's really going to change his leadership style later when he does actually take the throne. Basically, what was going on when Louis was very young is Cardinal Richelieu's successor, Cardinal Mazarin, had increased taxes and strengthened the central government, which led to anti-Mazarin riots. A lot of people were not happy with some of the policies that Cardinal Mazarin had put together. And so what ends up happening is during these riots, Louis's life was threatened. The nobles had threatened his life, and Louis grew up basically vowing revenge. He was not going to be very sympathetic to the nobles. He was not going to be sympathetic to the people. This doesn't make him really a bad guy, but it's an experience that's always going to stay with him. And he's going to want more power for himself rather than working well with other people. Excuse me. Now, the riots, which were led by the nobles, ultimately failed. So the nobles' rebellion failed for 3 reasons. First of all, they really didn't trust each other, and that's problematic in any type of team situation, whether you're talking about sports or classroom-related activities, or in this case, a rebellion. The other thing that happened here is the government was able to call in the troops, so the government used violent repression, definitely showing who is in charge in this case. And the last thing that really caused this to fail is the peasants and the townspeople grew weary of fighting. Now, this is sort of an early skirmish. It's not part of the French Revolution, but it does show that the people, nobles and peasants included, are upset with what's going on in the country. Now, imagine that stews for another 100 years or so, and you're definitely putting a situation that's going to be ripe for a massive revolution like the French Revolution. So again, kind of just a little precursor here, but it doesn't work. It fails. Now, Louis's power is going to be a really interesting thing, because Louis takes total control at age 22. He definitely worked to make sure his power was greater than the nobles, so he excluded the nobles from his councils, and he did that to strengthen his own power, basically saying any policy-making ability you had, any type of say you had in government no longer exists. I am the state. I am the king. And so he's really going to use his own power to manipulate France. And one of the ways you do that is you increase the power of something called intendants. Intendants are government agents. These are people who went around, collected taxes, administered justice. In a way, were kind of like Louis's guys. They were people who listened to the king and made sure the king's laws were being followed. Whereas typically, nobles really were able to kind of do what they wanted to They had power out in the countryside, they had land, and Louis wanted to strip that away from them, so he used the intendants rather than the nobles on his council, and made sure they had prominent roles in the government. So Louis made the nobles completely dependent on him by making him come live with him at the palace. He said, hey, you've got power, you've got land, but I'm going to make you come and live with me. It's like, it's home field advantage. Taking the nobles away from their home field advantage. Now they're, in an awkward situation. There's stories that he made them help him get dressed in the morning. Some of the nobles, it was just an absolute honor to help the king put on his socks in the morning. And so things like that, it's humiliating. When you think about it, these nobles kind of by right have had wealth and status, but now Louis is taking that away from them so that they really become regulated to servants in a way. One of the things Louis wanted to do is he wanted to make France self-sufficient. He wanted definitely to show that the more wealth they had, the more power they had. That goes back to our idea of mercantilism. So he wanted to prevent wealth from leaving France, so he tried to make France able to manufacture everything they needed. If you think back to our story on Spain and how a lot of the wealth left Spain, Louis wanted to avoid that here. So he wanted to make France self-sufficient to prevent wealth from leaving France, so they manufactured everything they needed in France. Probably, though, the most important thing that we remember about Louis XIV is his lifestyle. And that's nowhere more prevalent than his home. Louis built the absolutely amazing palace at Versailles, which is perhaps the biggest and most beautiful palace on earth. A lot of different things. It had like 700 rooms, all these different fountains and gardens, and I'll show you several pictures here. And it's just kind of an example. One of the regular occurrences that happened here at Versailles was these big meals that Louis would have every day. This was not like a once-a-week thing. This happened regularly. One observer claimed that the king had once devoured 4 plates of soup, a whole pheasant, a partridge in garlic sauce, 2 slices of ham, a salad, a plate of pastries, fruit, and hard-boiled eggs, all in a single sitting. You needed nearly 500 cooks, waiters, and other servants to really satisfy his tastes. So when you think of that, coupled with this giant palace he lived in, he's definitely spending a lot of money on himself. To give you an idea, Versailles is just about 11 miles outside of Paris, as we can see here on this map. He basically uproots the government and moves it to Versailles with this palace. You can see an aerial look here. It's absolutely stunning. Just huge, added on to several different times. You can see some of the gardens here. You can imagine all the workers needed for this. And who's paying for this? It's the taxpayers. Taxpayers are paying every dime of this. So this is something an absolute monarch can get away with. If our president tried to do this today, he'd be impeached tomorrow. It's not even possible. But because Louis was an absolute monarch, he could do this. One of the most iconic pieces of the Palace of Versailles is the Hall of Mirrors. So you can see here, just really, really beautiful. Certainly all the chandeliers in gold and paintings would have been a sight to see. This is where the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I was signed, right here in the Hall of Mirrors. So you see a different look of this. This would have basically been Louis's throne room. Ambassadors and dignitaries would have come down this hallway to meet with the king, and it would have definitely been something that would have intimidated people to kind of say, hey, look what the French have. Look who the French are. Look at this beautiful Hall of Mirrors. Continuing on with Louis's power, under Louis XIV, France had 20 million people. So it's definitely more than England, more than the Dutch. You can think about the army you can have with that many people. Think about the taxes you can bring in. It's definitely a very large number for this time period. So the French army was far ahead of the other states in size, training, and weaponry. This is going to really be when France's army really starts to help make France become the biggest and most powerful empire in Europe. Now, When we look at Louis's legacy, it's sort of a mixed bag. Because Louis is going to do some things that are, remembered for not being so good, but he wasn't a hated king or anything like that. Louis had invaded the Spanish-controlled Netherlands in 1667 and had gained 12 towns at that point. He tried to fight more wars, but the rest of Europe allied against him to ensure that France would not dominate all of Europe. This is where something really scary almost happens. If you're the rest of Europe. The King of Spain died after promising his throne to Louis' 16-year-old grandson. So a lot of people said, uh-oh, if Louis' grandson gets Spain, that means France and Spain are going to unite into one giant empire. So what it ended up leading to was the War of Spanish Succession. The fear here was that the Bourbons would control both Spain and France. And long story short, it ends with the Treaty of Utrecht. And the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht stated that Louis' grandson could have Spain as long as France and Spain did not unite. So if you remember in part 1 when I talked about Juan Carlos being the former king of Spain but being a member of the Bourbon dynasty, that's how we see that connection. So the Spanish do have their connection to the Bourbons, but Spain and France were not allowed to ever unite as one giant country. It's a picture of the War of Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714. Just a map of the victories. British were involved. War of Spanish Succession. See, France and Spain. Mutually they share a border, so it would have been a really interesting combination had they ever been able to pull that off. Now, when Louis dies in his bed in 1715, people rejoiced in France. Not because he was a hated king, but more so because they were kind of sick of him. They were kind of done with his opulence and his spending. You can imagine the wars he fought, the palace that he built. He spent a lot of money on things that weren't really helping the people. And isn't that the goal of an absolute monarch, is to really take care of their people? So the French people didn't know it yet, but France was pretty deeply in debt. They just weren't feeling the effects quite yet. So he had left France in a very powerful state. France had ranked number 1 in Europe in art, in literature, statesmanship. Their army was number 1 in Europe. France was in a pretty good state when he died. However, like I said, France was the military leader of Europe, but they were very, very deeply in debt. So due to warfare and the palace at Versailles, France was deeply in debt. And debt causes a lot of problems. When we look at what's going to build up to the French Revolution, this is definitely a piece of that. So resentment over the tax burden of the poor would plague his heirs and lead to revolution later on. And the revolution would see the introduction of the guillotine, which is going to be one of the most unique killing devices of this era. So, the Sun King dies. It's a picture of Louis, his nickname the Sun King, in his deathbed. This emblem here represents the Sun King, as you can probably imagine there. And Louis passes away. Alright, let's wrap up this lecture on absolutism and absolute monarchs by revisiting our question here. The question says, summarize what an absolute monarch is and provide at least 2 concrete examples. Well, we know an absolute monarch is a king or a queen, and that's key. You have to have the king or queen part of the definition that controls everything within their state's boundaries. And that can include the military, that can include the economy, that can include building projects. It can also really mean controlling religion as well. Many of the absolute monarchs in Europe believed in something called divine right, meaning that they had the right to rule from God, and they were God's representative on earth. And so when we see these absolute monarchs, they can really do whatever they want to do. And if they want to take care of their people, they can. But if they choose not to, they can also get away with that as well.
So to answer the second part of the question, provide at least 2 concrete examples. We now have Louis XIV as our probably most famous example that we can use. I mean, he built the palace at Versailles. He spent a lot of money on himself, fighting wars, things like that. We're going to see Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette later in this unit. We can use them as examples, so we'll build into this question a little bit later. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this, we can also use Henry VIII from England, who created his own church simply so he could divorce his first wife. We could use him as an example, and we could use Philip II as an example. Now, Philip's maybe not a great example because he still is very Catholic and tied to the Pope, but he did have an immense amount of power in Spain. So, gang, that is going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something about absolutism and absolute monarchs. We'll catch you next time.